The man known to history as Hannibal Barca was born in 247 BC in current-day Tunisia. His father was the general Hamilcar Barca, who was head of the Barcid clan, a wealthy and well-connected aristocratic house of landowners whose traditional home was located around the Sahel region of North Africa. A natural leader who descended from a long line of famous warriors and heroes stretching back to the earliest days of the empire. In the same year that his son was born, Hamilcar was selected as the commander of Carthaginian forces battling against Rome on the island territory of Sicily. Because of this, he was often away on military campaigns, meaning he was absent for much of his son's early childhood. While we can get a sense of Hamilcar from ancient records, there is hardly any information available on his wife and Hannibal's mother, whose name has been lost to the sands of time. What we do know is that she also gave birth to Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Margot, and his 3 sisters, who married into other high-born households. Very few images of Hannibal exist, apart from the Capuan bust which, discovered in Italy in 1667, is purported to depict the legendary Carthaginian general, although this is by no means universally accepted. It shows an older, bearded man with a face lined with wrinkles, staring contemplatively off into the distance, the weight of an empire on his shoulders. In personality, Hannibal was a soldier's soldier, who endeared himself to his men by sharing in their burdens and hardships. Instead of taking a back seat in battle or hiding himself away in luxury, he often fought on the front lines with those he commanded and slept on the cold, hard ground among them in an attitude that inspired unbreakable loyalty. Lastly, he was also a brilliant strategist, whose use of psychological warfare and illusion to terrify and outsmart his opponents made him virtually unbeatable in pitched battles. According to legend, towards the end of the 9th century BC, Carthage was founded by a princess of Phoenicia who had fled her homeland in the city of Tyre, in modern-day Lebanon, and the tyranny of her brother king. Over the next 3 centuries, this humble trading entrepot evolved into a vast commercial empire and the Mediterranean Sea's most preeminent civilization. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had become highly threatened by the aggressive expansion of the North Africans, the last straw coming in 264 BC when Carthage began developing a port town at Acragas in Sicily that would open up the way to the as-of-yet unconquered lands of eastern Sicily, far too close to the Italian mainland for comfort. The Romans launched a preemptive strike at Acragas, setting in motion the First Punic War, which lasted from 264 BC to 241 BC. It was at the tail end of this conflict, after decades of bitter fighting on sea and land that had significantly weakened Carthage, that Hannibal Barca first saw the light of day in 247 BC. Born into a family of the highest noble pedigree, Hannibal would have likely spent his early childhood in one of the magnificent villas situated in the hills that overlooked the city and its double harbor. It was here that he would have had private lessons with his Greek tutor, Sosilus, who taught him how to write and read with the aid of classical Greek texts, such as Homer's Odyssey and Aristotle's Logic. In 244 BC, Carthage's governing body, the Council of Elders, which was composed of rich merchants who preferred trade to war, began vociferously condemning the Punic War, which had dragged on for close to 2 decades. While the military families in Carthage, such as the Barcids, wanted to continue and re-establish naval superiority, the wealthy traders believed it was time to leave the Mediterranean behind and expand into Africa. At this point, the Romans were beginning to turn the tide of war in their favor, because they had made lightning advances in naval technology. This became apparent on March 10, 241 BC, at the Battle of the Agates Islands in western Sicily, when they completely outclassed the hastily assembled Carthaginian navy, prompting the Council of Elders to negotiate a quick surrender. The military wing were outraged by the terms of the Treaty of Lutatius, in which Carthage had agreed to relinquish its claims to Sicily, to withdraw its forces from the surrounding islands, and to pay back 2,200 silver talents in war reparations, in a major blow to its international prestige. When Hamilcar reluctantly returned to Carthage, there is no doubt that the young Hannibal would have felt the bitterness exuding from his absent father. His anger would have been heightened in 239 BC, when foreign and homegrown mercenaries that had fought in the Punic Wars rebelled against Carthage after the Council of Elders had failed to pay them. Hamilcar made light work of the revolters, many of whom he had fought side by side with, by crushing their leaders with war elephants and publicly crucifying their foot soldiers. Then the next year, Hamilcar could only look helplessly on as the Romans, taking advantage of the turmoil in Carthage, mounted a completely unopposed takeover of Sardinia, an island which hadn't been ceded to the Romans. Hamilcar's frustrations with the incompetence of the Council of Elders and condemnation of the Romans would have been absorbed by the young and impressionable Hannibal. In public, he also aired these grievances, taking particular aim at the man responsible for his country's fall from grace, the head of the Carthaginian Senate, Hanno. By 237 BC, Hamilcar had become so influential that he had managed to successfully persuade the council to approve an invasion of Spain, the plan being to take control of the region's fabulously rich silver mines, to acquire a revenue stream to pay back the Romans and rebuild quicker. Naturally, the Senate jumped at the chance to not only satisfy a large section of their population who disapproved of their withdrawal, but to put a dangerous and popular opponent at a safe distance. As preparations were underway, Hamilcar would have informed his 9-year-old son that it was time for him to become a man by joining him in Spain. Shortly before they departed, Hamilcar brought his son to the gates of the Temple of Baal for him to make a sacred vow to the gods. There in the inner chambers, Hannibal, whose name translates to "Baal be gracious to me," ascended the pagan altar and placed his hand on a sacrificial animal. As he swore his undying hatred of Rome, the living offering was killed, and his destiny was at once tied to Baal's for eternity. Landing in Spain in 237 BC, while his father got the silver mines up and running and dealt with the local tribes, the young Hannibal was assigned a new teacher, who trained him in swordsmanship and archery. Between 235 BC and 231 BC, as he witnessed his father defeat and pacify troublesome elements in northern Andalusia and western Valencia, he would learn how to ride his horse as if they were a single unit, how fast or slow an army moved over certain terrain, how to outwit the enemy with good tactical choices, and how to lead from example. Then in 229 BC, Hamilcar turned his attention to a troublesome confederation of small kingdoms composed of the Vettoni, Turduli, and Turdetani tribes. Having reached the age of 19, Hannibal was deemed old enough to lead a small scouting detachment that would also include his younger brother, Hasdrubal. It was during this particular campaign that disaster struck, when Hamilcar was ambushed and killed by the treacherous Vettoni tribe after entering into negotiations. According to one account, upon finding himself outnumbered, Hamilcar diverted attention away from his son's small band and sacrificed himself to allow them to escape. Hannibal, now 20 years old, would not have long to grieve, for he was immediately entrusted with taking over his father's duties, while his older brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, administered the newly absorbed Spanish colonies. Between 228 BC and 221 BC, Carthage remained virtually unchallenged as it consolidated large swathes of southern Spain, and in the process, Hannibal would even take a Spanish wife by the name of Princess Emils. In 221 BC, Hasdrubal the Fair fell in battle, and Hannibal assumed full control over the armies of Carthage in Spain, which he directed from his stronghold in Cartagena. Obeying the lessons he had learnt from his father and from his formative combat experiences, he hit the ground running by subduing the tribes that occupied the western fringes of the Iberian colony. However, there was another more pressing concern that now occupied his thinking. Above all, Hannibal wanted to make his deceased father proud and to honor the pact he had made with Baal just before he had embarked on his journey to Spain, and so he began stockpiling weapons and silver and training the soldiers necessary to achieve his ultimate aim, the full conquest of Rome. In the early spring of 219 BC, with an experienced army of grizzled veterans and a herd of 40 war elephants at his back, Hannibal marched from Cartagena to commence a siege of the frontier town of Saguntum, which had been infiltrated by Roman spies. Over the course of 8 months, he ignored demands from Rome to withdraw, began conversations with the repressed tribes of Gaul about allying against Rome, and received a javelin injury to the thigh whilst leading a frontline sally. Not desiring a repeat of the mercenary uprising his father had quashed that had nearly toppled Carthage, when Saguntum fell, Hannibal fairly distributed the loot to his warriors and, thinking of the future, he set aside a large portion of the spoils for his war chest. After wintering in Cartagena, in the late spring of 218 BC, Hannibal crossed the Ebro River, which officially divided Carthage's territories from the sphere of influence of Rome's allies in Hispania. At this point, he was ready to take on anything that was thrown at him. Reaching the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains, he got rid of the dead weight by dismissing 7,000 rebellious Celtiberian tribesmen, meaning that by the time he entered Roman territory, he had a force of fewer than 70,000 soldiers. After crossing the Pyrenees, Hannibal was more peacefully received by the Celtic peoples of France, who were tired of living under the Roman thumb. Having penetrated into Gaul, the Carthaginian army turned east and marched towards the Rhone River that led into Italy as the Romans augmented their defensive capabilities. Hannibal was kept informed every step of the way by an impressive network of spies that outlined Roman troop movements, local conditions, and geography in perhaps the earliest known example of a military reconnaissance operation. Conducting the intelligence gathering were wagoners, carters, metalworkers, and craftsmen on the ground, while in loftier places the role was assumed by Roman moles beguiled by Carthaginian silver and even foreign women who some historians claimed used pillow talk to extract sensitive information from the Roman elite. In late summer, when the Rhone River was at its shallowest, Hannibal bought canoes and rafts from the friendly Celtic tribes to make the crossing. However, waiting for him on the other side was a large gathering of hostile Volcae Celts who, for reasons unknown, wanted to obstruct his progress. With the Celts ready to spill blood the moment his men got in range, he devised a brilliant plan that was set in motion when a small but formidable force of Carthaginian infantry, led by his relative Hanno, moved north up the river under the cover of darkness in order to make a crossing further upstream. The next day at dawn, Hanno set off a smoke signal which indicated that his forces were within striking distance of the amassed enemy. Timing it perfectly, Hannibal's men jumped aboard the rickety rafts and canoes, and just as they came into the range of the Volcae, Hanno pounced on the Celts from behind. As Celtic organization disintegrated, Hannibal disembarked as part of the first wave and drove them away before establishing a temporary camp to oversee the safe passage of the rest of his army. While this wasn't a problem for his infantry, who clung onto the rafts and canoes to make the short voyage, it was a problem for the 37 enormous war elephants that were also in his party. In order to get these fearsome beasts across safely, engineers fastened several smaller rafts together with rope. Then they tied both ends of the larger platform to trees on either side of the river, making a sort of floating wooden bridge. However, when the elephants set foot on the bobbing wood, some of them panicked, flinging many of their riders into the river and to a watery grave. Despite this, an eyewitness account reported that none of the 37 war elephants perished, with many supposedly getting across the deeper parts by raising their trunks into the air in snorkel fashion. Having overcome the Rhone River, Hannibal received intelligence that a Roman force was encamped at Massilia, better known as modern-day Marseille, and so he sent a party of 500 cavalry to reconnoiter the area. Meanwhile, on the east bank of the Rhone, the Generalissimo met with a large gathering of disenchanted Italian Celts led by Magulus, the chieftain of the Boii tribe, who agreed to join Carthage's swelling ranks. They would be needed sooner rather than later, for when scouts returned, they reported that they had made contact with Roman horsemen and lost about 300 men in the ensuing scrap. Nevertheless, for the time being, Hannibal was content with keeping the Romans at bay, so instead of confronting them, he commanded his troops to move north for the Alps. It's likely that he purposely avoided combat at this juncture, simply because a conflict in Gaul would inevitably lead to the collateral destruction of the villages and crops of the indigenous Celtic inhabitants that he was keen to get on his side. Although from the outside it looked a little foolish, the path that Hannibal took was a wise one, for by going north he would completely avoid the coastal Mediterranean route and Massilia, which were both teeming with enemy armies and fortified garrisons. The downside, however, was that he would now have to cross through the treacherous Alps to strike at the heart of Italy, a maneuver that even the most skilled tacticians of his day would have considered practically impossible. Provided with a fresh injection of food, supplies, warm clothing, and thick leather shoes by friendly natives, the ascent of the Alps began when the convoy reached what is commonly termed the gateway to the Alps, a narrow valley framed by steep bluffs on either side, situated just outside of modern-day Grenoble. Up ahead, they had been warned that an aggressive group of Allobroges lay in wait, and that they would most likely ambush them from high in the cliffs. Not willing to blindly follow the path and risk death from above, at nightfall, Hannibal left the majority of his army in the low valley pass, telling them to keep their fires burning so they could draw the Allobroges in. With all eyes on them below, Hannibal stealthily led a small contingent of his most skilled warriors up to the enemy watchposts, which were seized. The next morning, the mountain clan realized they had been outsmarted, yet when they spied the treasure and resource-laden lines moving slowly through the thin valley, they still couldn't resist attacking it. From their high fortress, they flooded down, taking aim at the thickest, juiciest, and least protected segment of the caravan. Hemmed in by hysterical barbarians on a steep hillside, panicked horses rushed to and fro, knocking off pack animals and men into the foliage below, where they were killed and stripped. In response, men higher up in the column were ordered to advance down to relieve the beleaguered midsection. while some were sent further below into the shrubbery to pick off enemy clusters. However, the Allobroges soon got a taste of their own medicine when one of their strongholds, which was stuffed with winter food supplies, cattle and some of the captured pack animals, was taken once Hannibal had regained the initiative. Having comprehensively defeated the aggressors, plundered their resources, and even regained what had been lost, the mountain tribes of the Alps would now think twice about engaging the North Africans. As summer turned to autumn, the weather became increasingly cold and icy. Yet rather than holing himself up in a comfortable, heated tent, Hannibal shared his men's hardship by sleeping on the stone-cold ground, wrapped up in a few blankets. In early wintertime, the army traversed the much wider Arc River Valley, with the plants along the riverside providing ample sustenance for the war elephants. Knowing that the deeper they penetrated into the mountains, the more dangerous it would get, Celtic scouts were sent ahead to surveil surrounding regions, and when they came back, they had to personally report to Hannibal himself, who would have grilled them with questions and watched their body language closely for any signs of betrayal. Then, 2 days after they had crossed the Arc River, as they prepared for the steepest climb yet, they were attacked again by yet another group of Celts in a gorge. From high above, they rolled down boulders, hurled rocks, and fired off volleys of arrows, transforming the orderly columns into a disorganized mass of cries and screams that reverberated and echoed around. Barking orders above the din, Hannibal's army regained its composure as the Celts swooped out of the nearby forests, crashing into the heavy infantry at the rear and mopping up the mangled and injured at the front. As night fell with no end in sight, the assailants were so assured that the Carthaginians were doomed that they returned home, leaving only a few behind to guard the mouth of the valley. However, like the Allobroges, they had seriously underestimated Hannibal's uncanny ability to get himself out of even the most desperate of situations. With the bulk of their force gone, the sentries were assassinated, and then as the first rays of dawn fell upon the valley, the army took an eastern path out of the gorge to escape. Emerging onto an alpine plateau of snow-capped peaks, burbling waterfalls and sprawling forest, the battered survivors thanked the gods for delivering them to safety. Yet with very few pack animals left to consume, they were now at risk of starvation, having reached the highest known point of the Alps. Depressed, exhausted, hypothermic and famished, the disfigured army encamped at the summit for 3 days to recover and to wait for stragglers to catch up to them. Having detected a great dip in morale, Hannibal led them to a precipice that offered a panoramic view of the prize that awaited them on the other side of the Alps. For the first time, his men set eyes on Italy, and as they did so, one ancient chronicler claims that Hannibal made an inspirational speech to reinvigorate their spirits. Over the course of the next 3 days, the army made a descent that was as treacherous as the ascent, but for different reasons entirely, as they overcame dangerous near-vertical cliff faces and randomly falling rocks. Having put the nightmare of the Alps behind them, the army struck into the Po Valley and massacred the Taurini tribes who had rejected their advances to demonstrate to the surrounding natives that it was better to make friends with the Carthaginians than to make enemies with them. Taking heed of this, the western tribes of Padana were the first indigenous Italians to join up with Hannibal as a Roman army led by Publius Scipio funneled into the Po Valley, ready to defend their motherland at all costs. Before his combat debut in Italy, and in view of his assembled army, Hannibal held up a lamb in honor of Baal, beating it to a pulp with a stone as part of a ritual sacrifice. The 218 BC Battle of the Ticinus commenced when, on the flat plains of Padana, the heavy cavalries of Rome and Carthage charged towards each other and clashed at such an astonishingly rapid pace that the Roman javeliners further back had no time to let off their projectiles. Then Hannibal's lightning-fast Numidian cavalry maneuvered around to outflank the cluster of Roman horsemen, while at the same time they crushed the exposed Roman javeliners as they fled. Now being harried at the front and the rear, it wasn't long until the severely wounded Roman commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, called for his army to fall back to the nearby Ticino bridge, which was destroyed to prevent the Carthaginians from crossing and dealing more damage. Word quickly spread across the Italian realm of the triumph, and soon Hannibal was inundated with delegations of natives keen to join the offensive as he advanced to the southern side of the River Po, one step closer to his ultimate goal. For the Romans, the utter disaster of the opening engagement against the Carthaginians was compounded by an army-wide revolt of some of their Celtic allies, who brought Roman heads and prisoners to Hannibal to prove their newfound loyalties. In the meantime, the Roman Senate called upon another of its star generals, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, to get the job done where Publius Scipio had failed. Having seized Malta from Carthaginian hands, it was thought that Sempronius had the military acumen to defeat Hannibal, despite the fact that the Mediterranean island had been left relatively undefended and very easy to take. This overrated victory had inflated the ego of Sempronius, who was eager to achieve glory and personal fame whenever the chance arose, and it was this impulsiveness that Hannibal would use to his advantage. Wanting to fight on his own terms, and keenly aware he would soon need another victory to stop his plunder-hungry Celts from going off the rails, Hannibal selected a flat, treeless plain on the west side of the Trebia River as the battleground. Knowing that the Romans, who preferred to fight on flat terrain, wouldn't pay any attention to the tangle of reeds and bushes on the riverbank in their battle strategy, 2,000 infantrymen and cavalry were quietly placed there. The Battle of Trebia got going when a contingent of Numidian cavalry rushed towards the Roman camp at daybreak and shot as many arrows as possible in order to draw out the Roman legions, commanded by Sempronius as well as Publius Scipio. Predictably, the arrogant Sempronius took the bait and mobilized his entire ill-equipped army, who were thrust into action without even having a sufficient breakfast. Just as expected, the Roman infantry and heavy cavalry were lured north by the quicker Numidian cavalry to the flat plain, where the trap had been laid. In order to get there, the Romans had to cross the icy, energy-sapping river, leaving them cold and sodden and without the option of turning back. As they reached the other side and sluggishly climbed the hill to the battlefield, with bellies groaning, Sempronius's legions would have caught sight of the 8,000 pikemen and slingers that constituted the advance guard of the enemy, as well as the 20,000 heavy infantry, flanked by 10,000 cavalry and 37 war elephants. In his hubris, Sempronius was convinced that his superior numbers would simply terrorize them into submission. Yet he would soon be proven wrong when the Carthaginians, who had been well rested the night before, ferociously charged into his flagging, exhausted ranks with a powerful jolt of energy. Then, just as things couldn't get any worse, the ambush was sprung and hordes of Hannibal's bravest warriors smashed into the rear, butchering what was left of the Romans. In the aftermath, having slaughtered 15,000 Romans, the remaining Celts who had been on the fence took the plunge and joined Hannibal, who promised that he would guarantee their freedom, resulting in the replacement of most of the losses he had suffered in the Alps. His generous treatment of treacherous Celtic captives, who were released back to their clan without any penalties, further encouraged those who weren't so sure about him to side with him, while his occupation of Publius Scipio's former camp also gave him an air of invincibility that facilitated recruitment. Before they could outwit another cocksure Roman, the Carthaginian army first wintered in the territory of one of its longest and most loyal Celtic allies, the Boii tribe, while the Romans, now feeling threatened, ramped up conscription of its populace, leading to the formation of 11 new legions of 100,000 men, and amassed forces at Ariminium and Arretium, in anticipation for the enemy crossing of the Apennine Mountains. However, when the snow melted, Hannibal chose to take an unexpected and longer route across the treacherous Arno marshes, which meant that he would be approaching Arretium from the northwest, to the great surprise of the legions stationed there. By the time Hannibal had set out, the cold season had also claimed the lives of most of his war elephants, who were unaccustomed to European winters, with the only survivor being the Asian elephant that was his personal steed. His march through the Arno marshes was one of the most difficult and trying of his military career, as the impossibility of setting up camp in a bog meant his men endured 4 days of no sleep and dehydration whilst trekking through water that came up to their knees or higher. Many pack animals would die where they collapsed, and amongst the men, cholera, tuberculosis, and other waterborne diseases were rife. But it wasn't just the grunts who were suffering, for Hannibal himself contracted a disorder called ophthalmia, leading to the loss of sight in one of his eyes. When they finally emerged onto the dry countryside of modern-day Florence, the Celtic portion of the army, who had been sandwiched in between more reliable troops during the crossing, in an indication that they couldn't be fully trusted, pillaged and plundered the surrounding area in a release of frustration that was welcomed by the one-eyed Hannibal. Having rested and resupplied, the now grizzled 30-year-old military maestro made it seem as if he was heading directly towards Rome by bypassing Arretium to the alarm of its novice commander, Gaius Flaminius Nepos. As a statesman who had risen to the top echelons of the Roman political ladder, mainly through the support of the common people, or plebeians, Flaminius was despised by the blue-blooded Roman patricians, who viewed him simply as a rabble-rousing demagogue with no real substance. Fancying himself as a military tactician, so distrustful was he of the aristocracy that he had gone to Arretium without the approval of the Senate, despite the fact that he had never even fought a battle, let alone orchestrated one. Employing his network of spies and informants, Hannibal would have been well aware of his opponent's inexperience when he drew up the plan to entrap him in what is now known as the Battle of Trasimene. Ignoring several bad omens that predicted disaster, Flaminius went after Hannibal without even sending a scouting party ahead, and set up camp just before the entrance to a narrow valley called the Borghetto Gap that was bordered by Lake Trasimene. With the fires at the other end believed to be Hannibal's army, he ordered a forward march through the valley on a fog-drenched morning. But as the Romans poured into the confined space, a war bugle sounded and Hannibal's cavalry rushed down the hills behind them to cut them off. Trapped on 3 sides by foes, as well as the marshy lake edge, 15,000 Roman soldiers were decimated over the course of 3 terrible hours. Flaminius was killed by a lance, and 6,000 Roman soldiers were captured, with only the Celtic troops spared execution to motivate them to switch sides. To top it off, Roman cavalry reinforcements sent from Ariminium, headed by Servilius Geminus, were then intercepted, and half were slain in a devastating finishing blow that added yet another 2,000 Roman lives to the death tally. The defeat sent shockwaves through Rome, causing such widespread hysteria that the Senate convened for days from morning to night, discussing how they could restore any semblance of order, their eventual decision being to appoint battle-proven legionnaire Quintus Fabius Maximus as an emergency military dictator. As Hannibal marched his armies down the Adriatic coast, seizing autumn harvests and destroying everything and everyone in sight, Roman citizens made extra sacrifices to appease the gods, Entire towns were evacuated, Rome's city defenses were bolstered, and 2 new legions of conscripts were raised. All the while, Hannibal's progress was hampered for the first time thanks to a significant shift in strategy. Instead of trying to stop him with the all-or-nothing battles that had up to that point consistently failed, Quintus Fabius Maximus hewed to a more conservative containment strategy that involved intermittently harassing enemy flanks with small raids, while simultaneously cutting off their ability to resupply via the tactical destruction of farms and crops. Having learnt from the mistakes of his foolhardy generals, he also made sure to keep to the higher ground so that Hannibal could not get the jump on him. Fabius was heavily criticized by those who preferred a more direct approach, yet it was because of his cautiousness that a tantalizing opportunity to capture Hannibal arose. As the Carthaginians headed east to winter at Apulia after looting Campania, forward scouts reported that the Casilinum pass ahead was blocked by Roman troops under Fabius. So as night fell, Hannibal ordered his men to attach bundles of dry sticks to 2,000 of the strongest cattle. After being set alight, the agitated cows were herded towards a side ridge, giving off the appearance of a full army on the move, while the real army was hidden just below the enemy guards. Awakening from their slumber, the Romans left their posts and hurriedly ran towards the long, flickering torrent of light, while the Carthaginian army slipped through the now undefended pass. The next morning, Quintus Fabius Maximus was mortified to find that they had seemingly disappeared into thin air in one of Hannibal's most iconic maneuvers. After wintering at Apulia as planned, and engaging in only minor skirmishes with the Romans for the entirety of 217 BC, Hannibal moved his army south to Cannae to ransack the fertile surrounding farmland and prepare for the arrival of an enormous Roman force that would have a 2-to-1 numeric advantage. On August 2, 216 BC, both armies thundered towards each other for what is regarded as one of the most epic battles of the ancient era, the Battle of Cannae. The first segment of the Roman army to collapse was the right flanking cavalry, which, hemmed in by the river Aufidus, did not have enough space to wheel around and attack with speed, resulting in the majority being dismounted and slaughtered. Elsewhere, the middle Roman section, comprising of 8 tightly packed legions of heavy infantry, fared a lot better, being able to push back the thin line of Celtic and Spanish elements with their greater numbers. Like clockwork, however, they were purposefully falling back, for as the Roman infantry advanced, they were gradually being surrounded on 3 sides. This was because after dealing with the right flank by the river, Hannibal's cavalry had wheeled around to add bodies to the attack on the left Roman cavalry flank, which began to give way. The Romans were now ensnared in a 3-sided pincer movement, with the defeated cavalry unable to assist the overcommitted central infantry that was being surrounded. Swallowed by Hannibal's hordes, the overconfident foot soldiers were wiped out, and by the end of the day, 55,000 Romans had been slain, equating to 20% of all Roman males between the ages of 18 and 50. Back in Rome, panic reached fever pitch, with the very mention of the name Hannibal still evoking tremors of terror. The Carthaginian bogeyman put his full conquest of the capital on hold, going south to open up much-needed supply lines to North Africa and to drum up extra manpower from the oppressed city-states of southern Italy, most notably from Capua. Ancient and modern historians alike have speculated that this was the critical point at which Hannibal should have taken Rome, and his decision not to do so has since become one of the great what-ifs of history, for it was from here onwards that his movement started to lose momentum. This was because, although he was able to secure many alliances in southern Italy, like the Celts, they could not be relied upon, because they frequently changed allegiances at the first sign that a rival faction was gaining dominance. For example, his friendship with Capua, a major regional player, dissuaded other city-states from committing fully to his cause, their logic being that if Hannibal was successful, Capua would dominate over them in a post-Roman world, which was reason enough to not lend their support. Nevertheless, for the time being, emboldened by his great victory at Cannae, Hannibal continued to present himself as liberator, rather than an oppressor, by releasing many of Rome's captured Italian allies to signal that the only quarrel that he had was with their slave masters. Meanwhile, in the imperial capital, the wise Fabius Maximus, whose more relaxed strategy had been the only one to work thus far, was chosen as consul for the third time, while in desperation, Rome began recruiting criminals into their army to bolster their flagging numbers. Likewise, in 215 BC, Hannibal received additional reinforcements from Carthage, including 4,000 Numidian cavalry and 40 war elephants. However, a new Roman push into Spain and a planned reconquest of Sardinia meant that the majority of Carthage's men, animals, and resources had to be rediverted to these battlefields. Over the next 10 years, Hannibal occupied southern Italy with very little to show for it, mainly because he was given breadcrumbs by the Carthaginian Senate, and his enemies had essentially worked his strategy out. By keeping their distance and persistently nipping at their heels, the Romans were able to slowly wear the Carthaginians down as they hopelessly tried to get their fickle Italian allies to toe the same line. In addition, a lack of equipment meant that they struggled to pull off successful sieges, a prime example being Naples, which, supplied with ample provisions via its ports, resisted besiegement on 3 occasions. His fortunes were further dashed in 212 BC when the Romans seized Carthage's allies in Sicily, at Syracusa, after a siege lasting nearly 2 years. With hopes of resupply now a long-lost dream, Hannibal made a last-ditch effort, characterized by some as irrational and overly brash, to break the stalemate by attempting to take the prize he probably should have taken in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Cannae, that of Rome itself. In 211 BC, luring away the legions besieging Capua, he suddenly and unexpectedly marched north towards Rome, with a force headed by Fulvius Flaccus being rapidly deployed to chase him down. Taking a much shorter route, the tailing Romans arrived there first and stationed themselves at all the major gates and fortifications. When the Carthaginians caught up, in view of the entire Roman defense, Hannibal himself, the soldier's soldier, was said to have personally inspected the gate at Porta Collina that marked the northern edge of the city. There, within touching distance of the ultimate prize, he looked up to the intimidatingly high city walls, abundant with Roman personnel, that meandered away for 50 miles, and made the ultimately smart decision to retreat. Then, upon his return, he received the devastating news that the Capuans, who had thought they had been abandoned, had not only surrendered, but had been slaughtered by vengeful Romans keen to make them an example in one of Hannibal's greatest miscalculations. His prediction that the besieging troops would follow him and thus relieve Capua had proven terribly wrong, and in one fell swoop, he was deprived of his biggest support base. Despite some minor victories, including the 208 BC ambush of 2 consuls, Claudius Marcellus and Titus Quinctius Crispinus, which resulted in the death of the former, Carthage's allies began to fall like dominoes as the Romans slowly re-established their hegemony. Cut off, demoralized, and low on silver, Hannibal now only presided over a 50,000-strong ragtag mass composed mainly of Italian recruits and peppered with only a few original veterans. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Romans successfully drove back Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal Barca, preventing him from relieving his isolated sibling. Then the 209 BC capture of Cartagena by Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had survived the bloodbath at Cannae and whose father had been in command at the Battle of Ticinus, followed by a decisive defeat at the Battle of Baecula the next year, all but vanquished the Carthaginian presence from Iberia, permanently crippling their ability to raise funds. Stripped of allies, influence, manpower, and now silver, the only way Carthage's Italian sojourn could have any chance of succeeding was if Hasdrubal Barca and his army of 15,000 soldiers and 15 elephants could be brought over to help Hannibal break the deadlock. In the late fall of 208 BC, Hasdrubal made his way to the extreme west of Iberia and then travelled up into southern Gaul, where he wintered and recruited a sizable detachment of Celtic warriors before crossing the Alps. With his brother in the north and Hannibal struggling in the south, the ploy was to meet in the heartlands of Italy to pull off a repeat of the Battle of Cannae. However, every fine detail of their devious plan was revealed when Hasdrubal's messengers were captured. In response, Roman forces were posted to both of the routes that Hasdrubal might potentially take, while Hannibal, having not received the intel, had no idea what his brother was going to do. His confusion was further fomented by a deception carried out by General Claudius Nero, who, taking a page out of his enemy's book, made Hannibal think that his troops were stationed at Canusium, when in reality they were headed north to the Metaurus River to support the Roman armies preparing to meet his brother head-on. Hasdrubal was also deceived when Nero's reinforcements quietly arrived by night and shared tents with the Roman troops that were already there, in order to give off the impression that their camp had not been visibly enlarged. The next day, just before battle, Hasdrubal, realizing he was facing a much larger army than anticipated, retreated down the winding and unfamiliar Metaurus River, only to be trapped in a steep river valley. Knowing all was lost, Hasdrubal valiantly charged into the thickest section of the fray, preferring to die honorably than be taken as a prisoner. According to one story, Hasdrubal's head was removed and then placed on a sack that was thrown at the feet of his brother by a Roman envoy. There lies the fate of Carthage, Hannibal is alleged to have responded. With the Battle of Metaurus extinguishing all hopes of glory, the Romans took the initiative at home and abroad. In 206 BC, with Hannibal hopelessly confined to the southernmost portion of the Italian mainland, Bruttium, Publius Cornelius Scipio finished off Spain's reabsorption back into the imperial fold with a convincing win against Hannibal's younger brother, Margo Barca, at the Battle of Ilipa. With an ascendant Rome now winning on all fronts, in 205 BC, a counter-invasion of North Africa was approved. Landing at Cape Farina in northern Tunisia, the Roman invaders first seized the fortress of Utica after, in Hannibal-like fashion, carrying out a nighttime blitzkrieg on Carthage's sleeping soldiers, before beating them at the Battle of the Great Plain. Having seen Spain and then North Africa ransacked and despoiled, the Numidians, whose lightweight cavalry had been absolutely instrumental to Hannibal's success in Italy, now abandoned their old allies and changed allegiance to Rome. In desperation, the Carthaginian elders called on Hannibal to return, as yet another of his siblings, Margo, was slain by the Romans near Milan in 203 BC, whilst trying to relieve his trapped brother. Extracted from the tiny parcel of land in southernmost Italy that he now held, the last Barcid and 15,000 of his battle-weary veterans landed 100 miles away from Carthage at Leptis Minor to risk it all. Gathering 40,000 additional inexperienced conscripts, and 80 war elephants over the next few months, Hannibal deployed spies to secure intel on the relative strength of the Romans. But in a Hannibal-inspired psychological move, Scipio captured them, giving them a full guided tour of his superior units before sending them back alive. On the eve of the Battle of Zama, Hannibal and Scipio met, and when they laid eyes on each other, it is said that a palpable but respectful silence pervaded the air before they got down to business. Knowing there was little chance he could repulse them, Hannibal declared that he would give up claims to Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia in return for peace. But the Roman made it clear that the only way bloodshed would be avoided was if Carthage voluntarily placed itself under the authority of Rome. Both parties refused to budge, leading to the 202 BC Battle of Zama, the finale to the Second Punic War that had started nearly 20 years previously when Hannibal had first crossed the snow-capped Alps. Although the Romans had fewer men, with estimates putting their force at around 30,000, they were much better trained than Hannibal's raw recruits. Plus, they were reinforced by a wing of 2,000 Numidian cavalry, now pitted to fight against their old masters. Attempting to sow early discord within the ranks and thus prevent Scipio's Numidian cavalry from immediately outflanking them, Carthage's front-line elephants were ushered forward for the initial charge. However, a unique tactic developed by Scipio ensured that his men didn't buckle. As they stampeded forward, pockets of Roman soldiers separated away so that the grey beasts simply ran into empty corridors and lost their momentum. Next, assisted by the out-of-control elephants indiscriminately crushing their own forces, the Carthaginians' right cavalry flank was overwhelmed by the Numidians, while the central infantry front line, made up mostly of mercenaries, was shoved back by a disciplined Roman push. In the bedlam, the better training of the Romans prevailed, and before long the mercenaries had lost their resolve, cutting down their Carthaginian allies in a desperate attempt to save their own skins. As the Romans broke through to the more experienced contingents of Italian veterans stationed at the third and final line, with steely resolve, Hannibal reorganized his chaos-stricken army so that they formed one continuous line. But the heavy Roman infantry were too much for his flanks, with things taking a much darker turn when Scipio's victorious cavalry, having massacred most of the enemy horsemen, started systematically slaughtering the Carthaginians from behind. In the end, at the cost of just 2,000 Roman lives, 20,000 were killed and 20,000 were captured, prompting Hannibal to flee to his traditional family estates 120 miles to the east before he went to Carthage to deliver the damning report of his failure. Consequently, Carthage was stripped bare of its power and territories by Roman negotiators, who imposed ever harsher penalties than they had done previously, which included the reduction of their fleet, the handing over of all its elephants to Rome, as well as war reparations totaling 10,000 talents of silver, a remarkably greater sum than the 2,200 talents that Carthage had had to pay at the end of the First Punic War. Having given his all to save his country, despite astronomical odds, Hannibal was welcomed back into Carthage by the adoring masses, where he embarked on a short political career, culminating in his appointment as a suffet, a type of public magistrate, in 196 BC. Ever eager to decrease the influence of the mercantilist ruling class that he blamed for Carthage's woes, his most notable action was the passing of a law in the People's Assembly that prohibited anyone from holding the office of suffet for more than 2 successive years. Then in 195 BC, his crusade against his internal enemies came to a head when, having discovered many of them were embezzling and misappropriating funds, he began exposing them publicly. With the Council of Elders conspiring with their new overlords, A Roman Senate delegation was sent over to settle the matter, prompting Hannibal to make preparations for his escape. At nightfall, he made his way to the city gates, said goodbye to his beloved home, and was whisked away to the coast, where he boarded a ship bound for Carthage's ancient homeland in Tyre, now a vassal city of Antiochus the Great, king of the Syria-centered Seleucid Empire. In exile, Hannibal would now work towards Rome's ruin and thus keep the promise he had made to his father as a military advisor to the Seleucid emperor as he looked to expand his domains further into Asia. It was during this service that Hannibal and Publius Cornelius Scipio are said to have encountered each other somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, in an epilogue to the Battle of Zama. Bristling with respect for each other, multiple ancient sources relate how they candidly discussed the greatest generals of all time. Ranking himself third, Scipio is said to have retorted, "What would you have said if I had not conquered you?" To which Hannibal replied, perhaps in jest, "In that case, I would not have ranked myself third, but first." In around 189 BC, after inflicting heavy losses on the Seleucids, the Romans demanded that Hannibal be handed over to them, compelling the banished Barcid to flee to Crete, where he lived for a short while in anonymity. Then in 186 BC, he found himself at the royal court of King Prusias of Bithynia, located in distant Armenia, where imperial influence had yet to penetrate. Tasked with dislodging Prusias's pro-Roman rival, Eumenes II, Hannibal was responsible for one of the first recorded examples of biological warfare, when he ordered vipers to be tossed at enemy ships. In 183 BC, however, with Rome closing in on Asia Minor, Prusias stabbed him in the back by selling him out to curry favor with the Roman Senate. Refusing to be paraded and humiliated like a trophy, at the ripe old age of 64, a graying Hannibal took matters into his own hands. At his stronghold in Libisa, better known as modern-day Gebze in Turkey, the scourge of Italy drank poison to deny the Romans the satisfaction of taking him alive. From the very beginning, Hannibal Barca was taught to hate Rome, with every fiber of his being, for its humiliation of Carthage during the First Punic War. At 9 years old, he was first given the chance to fight for his homeland when he accompanied his father to Spain, marking the start of a decorated military career that would only finish when he was well into his 60s. As an apprentice general, through tutelage and personal experience, Hannibal learnt so much about the ways of war that by the time he was a young adult, he was already in charge of his own scouting detachment. However, following the death of Hamilcar and his elder brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, within a short space of time, he had been promoted to general of the Carthaginian army. A natural leader of men, there was no steep learning curve for the experienced tactician, as he efficiently subjugated and enslaved the unruly tribes of Iberia in much the same fashion as his legendary father. With Spain subdued and providing him with silver wealth beyond compare, Hannibal's next task was to extirpate Rome via an overland invasion and thus complete his life's purpose. After a tough first test, at the 8-month-long siege of Saguntum, with an enormous army of 37 war elephants, he crossed the Ebro River and then the Pyrenees to strike into the heart of Gaul, where, ignoring the more obvious coastal route to Italy, he surprised the Romans by taking a more perilous passage across the Alps. During his 16-day Alpine slog, Hannibal fended off hostile Celtic tribes, as well as cold and hunger, to emerge into the Po Valley of northern Italy, where he began enlisting the help of local Celtic tribes through a combination of fear, negotiation, and clemency. Using his lightning-fast Numidian cavalry and intelligence networks as the aces up his sleeve, he battered the Romans at the battles of Ticinus and Trebia. before taking an unexpected detour through the Arno marshes, where he lost sight in one eye. Then, after massacring the Romans with a surprise ambush at the Battle of Trasimene, he reached the apotheosis of his craft with a stunning victory at the Battle of Cannae. Having learnt the hard way that they were no match for him in a conventional warfare setting, the Romans resorted to harassing and harrying the Carthaginians to slowly whittle them down, as Hannibal's attempts to form a united front were impeded by the stubborn unwillingness of southern Italian city-states to work together. The breakneck speed of his invasion considerably slowed down, devolving into a lengthy and disappointing occupation of southern Italy. With Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily lost, and his brothers Hasdrubal and Margot Barca slain, Hannibal gave up on Italy and returned home where, with an inferior and weakened army, he was defeated at the Battle of Zama. After pursuing a brief political career in which he tried his best to flush out the corruption of his enemies within the Council of Elders, he fled Carthage for Tyre to avoid being handed over to the Romans, and for the rest of his days acted as a military advisor for a number of Rome's enemies. Betrayed by King Prusias of Bithynia in 183 BC, Hannibal ingested poison to avoid being captured and humiliated by the very man he had pledged to destroy. What do you think of Hannibal Barca? Do you think he was the greatest military commander of antiquity, or do you think his legacy is tarnished by his ultimate defeat at the hands of Rome? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.